Imagine you open your eyes in a cold 14th century castle. The most beautiful face of that era is not a radiant one, but a face that looks as if it has just stepped out of a grave. The paler your skin, the more noble you are considered. The darker the circles under your eyes, the closer people thought you were to God. The wider your forehead, the more your hairline was plucked back, the more you were praised as intelligent and pure. And if you laughed too loudly, forgive me, but that was considered vulgar. Yes, in those days, to be beautiful meant to be as fragile as paper, as silent as a statue, and as breakable as a crystal glass in another's hand. Tonight, before you sleep, we will whisper about these bizarre standards of beauty. From the toxic lead powder that turned your skin into a white porcelain wall, to the blonde hair bleached with a mixture of urine and summer sun, to the smile forced into a miserable pursing of the lips, a world where aesthetics was synonymous with self-torment. So, pull up the covers, let the lights dim, and join me on a sleepy journey, where beauty saved no one, but only turned people into smiling ghosts. In the medieval world, skin was not just a part of the body. It was a passport, a silent resume, a declaration without words. If you had tanned skin, people immediately knew you were a laborer in the fields, carrying water, plowing, bearing your back to the sun. The sun printed its mark on your skin like crude letters, and society immediately read them. But if you possessed skin as pale as wax, as translucent as parchment, revealing the fine blue veins running beneath your wrists and temples, then congratulations, you belong to the shade of the aristocracy. You did not touch the sun, which meant you did not need to work to live. And that, to them, was beauty. But how to become so white as to look like a ghost? The answer was a mixture of pseudoscience and true cruelty. Avoid the sun, starve the flesh, and apply things to your face that today we would only dare put in a chemical waste bin. In castles and manors, aristocratic women lived in almost deliberate darkness. Thick curtains were drawn, windows latched. If forced to go outside, they covered themselves with linen cloths, wide-brimmed hats, and even used a thin veil of fabric over their entire face like a mobile curtain. The sunlight, which was a symbol of life, was considered the number one enemy of beauty. A single ray of sun could turn a noble lady into a peasant girl. It was a humiliation. People would whisper warnings to each other. Don't let the sun write the wrong story on your child's face. And so, a generation of women grew up in the shade, sitting by closed windows, combing their hair by candlelight instead of under the blue sky. Natural whiteness was not enough. Society wanted a religious white, so white that the skin looked like beeswax. To achieve this, women concocted countless cosmetic recipes that make us shudder to read today. A famous recipe was to mix vinegar with crushed pearl powder. This mixture created a paste, applied to the face to make the skin brighter. But that was only the first step. The ingredient that truly made the skin unnaturally white was white lead. Yes, the toxic heavy metal, capable of corroding skin and poisoning the blood. But to the women of that time, it was high-end foundation. They applied it every morning to turn their healthy, rosy complexions into cold porcelain masks. The layer of lead covered all blemishes, freckles, and even fatigue. The only problem, it also covered life. The skin would soon peel, swell, and the blood vessels would gradually become poisoned. But if it made one look more aristocratic for a few years, the price was worth it. Before applying the lead, they would often prepare the skin with vinegar, salt, and sometimes even wood ash. These mixtures were rubbed vigorously, sloughing off the old layer of skin, leaving a more delicate surface. The result? A sensitive, red, and raw face, but one that more readily absorbed the white powder. Imagine sitting before a bronze mirror, a servant gently wiping your face with a vinegar-soaked cloth. It feels like tiny needles on your skin, but you don't grimace. Grimacing is ugly. Pain must be silent. Only the flickering candlelight remains, reflecting on a face as thin as a plaster statue. Not just fashion, but art and theology also reinforce this obsession. In paintings, the Virgin Mary was often depicted with radiant, almost translucent skin. The holy saints were the same. White was the color of purity, of a soul untouched by worldly dust. Therefore, mortal women were compelled to imitate that whiteness, as a way of proving they too were pure and devout. A tanned face meant desire, sin, and manual labor. A face as white as paper meant virtue, restraint, and power. Sit down and imagine the scene again. A young girl, just 16, sits before a mirror. Her forehead has already begun to be plucked to make it wider. Her skin is red and raw from vinegar. Her eyebrows have vanished. A servant is dabbing a thick white powder onto her cheeks. As the candle flickers, the face in the mirror suddenly no longer looks human. It resembles a wax figure, both beautiful and terrifying. But the girl says nothing. In those days, women did not keep beauty diaries. They just endured. And that silence is the cruelest part of the standard. The irony is that while the aristocracy hid in the dark to keep their skin white, out in the world, peasant women glowed with sun-kissed brown skin, their cheeks naturally rosy from labor. They were healthy, strong, and vibrant. But society did not praise that. For the aristocracy, skin flushed pink from good circulation was a shame. They preferred a face so pale it was almost lifeless. And so, the paradox arose. The living were considered vulgar, while those who looked as if they were about to faint were considered exquisitely beautiful. There are scattered stories throughout history. Women who lost their sight from skin-whitening chemicals. Noble ladies who died young from lead poisoning. Portraits showing faces that are too smooth, too still, like a ghost painted with powder. But that did not stop the trend. If society said that beautiful was pale, then thousands of women would find every way to achieve paleness. Because in that world, appearance was not just about aesthetics. It was destiny. It decided marriage opportunities, family status, and even the survival of a lineage. As you lie down in bed, thick curtains blocking the moonlight, your skin is covered with a layer of white lead, feeling heavy and slightly warm. You close your eyes, trying to sleep. But in your dream, you see yourself as a statue, cold, motionless, and glowing strangely in the dark. That was the price of being called beautiful. In the 14th century, your skin did not just cover your body. It covered your honor, your virtue, and your fate. From the stone room, still fragrant with rose water, we raise the candlelight higher, letting the halo fall directly on the hairline. Because tonight, the main character is no longer the eyes or the skin, but the forehead, a small space on the face, yet one that once determined honor, intellect, and marital destiny. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the wider the forehead, the more noble. Sounds simple, But the consequence of that simple phrase was that thousands of tweezers, razors, wax strips, bandages, and vinegar worked overtime for generations. Imagine the ideal face of that time as a leveled field. Anything unruly, considered weeds, had to be plucked clean. The natural hairline, as gentle as a hibiscus hedge in early summer, suddenly became an encroacher on public land. To be beautiful, one had to clear the sight. So every morning, before a bronze mirror, a quiet replanting took place. Tweezers lifted each baby hair, vinegar-soaked linen weakened them, and warm beeswax blocked their regrowth. Day after day, the boundary between hair and forehead receded, making way for a shiny runway that society called intellect. Why did a patch of forehead carry so many symbols? Because painting and theology at the time had made a secret pact. The emptier the forehead, the brighter the mind. In devotional art, the faces of saints were often as smooth as newly cast bells, with rarely a hair daring to encroach on the forehead area. When the church controlled most of the visual language, mortal people looked up, then looked at themselves, and began to edit. From then on, every pair of tweezers in a common bedroom became a tiny replica of a grand painting in the cathedral. However, art only set the blueprint. The real-life execution was the challenge. Step closer. The very soft snap as the first hair leaves its root. No scream. Here, pain was understood as a service fee. A servant would soak a cloth in vinegar, wring it lightly, and press it against the hairline. The vinegar softened the skin, making plucking faster. Some even used walnut oil or herbal remedies passed down by word of mouth with the promise of making hair lazy to grow back. Of course, many formulas only made the skin more irritated, but in an age where effectiveness was measured by compliments in the Great Hall, the stinging sensation was just a transitional step. And what about eyebrows? Oh, with the philosophy of the flatter, the purer, eyebrows were often seen as an irrelevant smudge. They were plucked so thin, they sometimes resembled a faint cloud, or erased completely to make the face a silent surface. That stillness was not just for aesthetic effect. It was also how society taught women to restrain their expressions. No frowning, no raising, no noise with one's gaze, just silence and brightness. Once again, aesthetics meddled with morality, and both nodded in agreement. Headwear completed the picture. Do you remember the hennin, the tall, conical hat that fairy tales often depict at the wrong angle? In real life, it was usually tilted back so as not to cover the forehead. Anything that covered the forehead was considered a waste of scenery. The hennin, veils, nets, snoods, all acted as picture frames, with the forehead as the canvas placed at the center. In some flamboyant courts, people even attached pearls or thin gold leaf along the hairline, like a string of lights marking the runway before the airplane took off for the evening banquet. The morning of a noble young lady could be described by a few repetitive actions: combing her hair back straight, determining today's mark, the new boundary of her forehead, wiping it clean with diluted vinegar, quickly plucking any stray hairs, applying a cold compress for a moment, dusting a thin layer of powder to make the forehead smooth, and pinning her veil so as not to intrude on the sacred area. This seemingly small task took a lot of time, but leisure time was an asset that a high forehead knew how to show off. Who, busy with a hoe, would have time to pluck hairs one by one? Sometimes, The ritual went beyond the rules. There were oral tales of ladies who pushed their hairlines too far, patchy scalps, uneven hair loss, forcing them to wear elaborate hats to cover it. Some tried to fix their hairline with tree sap adhesive, both to keep the hair from slipping forward and to keep themselves from changing their minds. Removing it at night was tearfully painful, but even crying had to be done skillfully. If your eyes swelled, you'd have to apply rosewater compresses the next morning, adding a new ritual on top of the old one. Artists, as usual, were the ones who bent reality to reinforce the ideal. In many portraits, the forehead was slightly elongated, baby hairs vanished, and eyebrows were transformed into a streak as fine as morning mist. The audience applauded the model. The model applauded the artist. Each painting became an invisible poster. This is a beautiful forehead. The public is advised to follow suit. Once the standard was hung on the wall, all that remained were bedrooms filled with the whisper of tweezers. Speaking of which, we should also touch upon another side of the story: fear. The fear that hair would not grow back in time for a party. The fear of tiny pimples on the forehead from irritation. The fear of a whisper at a ceremony. It seems her hairline today has moved forward. In an environment where every millimeter was a message, the body became a property to be guarded 24/7. And when the control was too tight, even peaceful sleep became as thin as paper. Yet, amidst the immense pressure, moments of humanity sometimes flickered. One afternoon, a 16-year-old girl asked her servant to stop, closed the mirror, and ran into the courtyard to catch a sunbeam on the steps. She laughed, tossing her hair back without the help of tweezers. Just for a minute, then she went back inside to continue the ritual. But that minute was enough to remember that the forehead was born to wrinkle, to frown, to be dotted with sweat when laughing too hard. Those natural functions, though taught to be forgotten, still lurked like young grass under a stone path. In the countryside, this standard progressed more slowly. A woman working under the sun had no time for a high forehead. She tied her hair back neatly, wore a scarf to keep off the dust, revealing a thick, healthy hairline. She needed a sharp gaze more than a wide forehead, strong hands more than faint eyebrows. But when they went to the city, they were still pursued by the paintings and rumors, reminding them that official beauty never belonged to them. The class divide was sometimes just the distance between two foreheads. Some cities even enacted rules on dress and jewelry to define who could wear what, cover what, and reveal what. The forehead became the body part subject to reverse censorship. The more it was revealed, the better, as long as it was smooth and wide enough. Ironically, that revealed part was achieved through countless hidden actions. Pain, rawness, bruising, swelling, all had to be dealt with in a private room before stepping out to the banquet table with a serene face. Society liked to see the product, not hear the machinery. There were also poets who helped fuel the trend. They wrote of a forehead like the dawn, not because the forehead could glow, but because it was so smooth that candlelight could easily slide across it, leaving a very clean streak of light. Those verses, when recited in the great hall, spread down to the kitchens, and then by carriage to the market. From the market, they entered the minds of girls who had never had their portraits painted, but still hoped to one day hear someone praise their forehead as high as knowledge. We should also talk about the side effects. Under the white powder, the freshly plucked skin was prone to irritation, developing tiny red pimples. Some applied herbal remedies. Some added more powder to cover them. Some accepted wearing a scarf for the day. In the gentle candlelight, all redness looked less threatening. But up close, you could still see the tired skin. That century had no recovery spas. The only thing they had was time. And time, ironically, was used to. Continue plucking. If you sat with a mother and daughter during a morning training session, you would hear phrases like, "Beauty is knowing what to remove." "An empty forehead for a full mind." "Pluck today so you won't have to toil tomorrow." These were mantras, both comforting and binding. The child would grimace at first, then get used to it, and eventually hold the tweezers herself. None of them intended to harm anyone. They were just passing on a survival map, drawn by the defaults of their era. And the map, as usual, did not ask the traveler for directions. Let's turn our gaze to the evening. The great hall is lit with torches. A lute's melody breaks in a corner of the room. You walk in, and your forehead, not your eyes, catches the firelight first. Someone whispers to the person next to them, "She is so bright." The word bright here does not just mean reflective. It also praises intelligence, virtue, and good breeding. One word, many layers, as thick as the powder you wear tonight. You nod very gently, like the oil lamp outside the door, nodding in the wind. No more needs to be said. The forehead has spoken for you. But before closing this chapter, allow me to return a little noise to the forehead, a surface that has been forced into silence for too long. Let it form a fine line when you are curious. Let it shine with sweat when you run up the stairs for good news. Let it crease when you laugh until you cry. Because every wrinkle is a word. And life, let me say it softly, so you can still sleep, is a book that shouldn't have its commas erased. Night has fully fallen. You remove your veil, place your hat on its stand. The tweezers lie still. The vinegar cloth has cooled. You tilt your head, pressing your forehead against the cool pillow. In the darkness, the forehead no longer needs to be wide. It just needs to be soft. Tomorrow may bring more construction, but for now, we turn off the light. Outside, the wind brushes against the roof tiles like a gentle hand. In a world that demands you always look as if you've just been molded, you are allowed to melt, to breathe slowly, and to sleep. Tomorrow, if someone asks, "Why is your forehead so beautiful?" you can smile and answer, half joking, half serious, "Because last night, I stopped having to hold it high." If the forehead was an airport for light to land, then the eyes were windows leading straight into darkness. But remember, not the kind of darkness that frightens people, but a darkness that was painted, praised, and revered as a delicate piece of jewelry. In the Middle Ages, beautiful eyes were not bright and full of life, but deep-set, tired, and always seeming to carry some holy sorrow. Imagine a young lady sitting by a narrow window, the candlelight flickering on her face. Her eyes are not sparkling, not brilliant, but tinged with a faint dark circle, enough for others to whisper, "She is so devout." She must have spent many nights in prayer to the point of exhaustion. In a place where faith was central, dark circles became a medal. Fatigue, instead of being criticized, was elevated to a symbol of devotion and purity. Late at night, when the servants had taken away all the candles, the eyes were still not allowed to sleep. It was believed that slightly sunken, slightly red eyes were a sign of a soul always busy conversing with God, praying so long that tears dried up, leaving a purple rim under the lashes. The next day, upon entering the church, your weary gaze would be an introduction without words. I did not sleep last night to keep God with me. Not only religion, but poetry also contributed to this praise. In many lyrical poems, the ideal woman was not a rosy-cheeked, healthy girl, but a slender maiden with eyes as wet and sad as mist. Medieval poets loved melancholy because they saw sadness as a gateway to depth. A bright smile might be fleeting, but a tired gaze was believed to be eternal. Of course, not everyone could naturally achieve the standard level of melancholy. So, the bedroom once again became a workshop. A little crushed charcoal, a little wine, or even dark herbal powder was mixed and lightly applied under the eyes to suggest a lack of sleep. A strange makeup technique, not to make you look more radiant, but to make you look like someone who had just spent a long night crying in secret. Some noble ladies even whispered to each other how to put a few drops of vinegar or onion juice in their eyes to make them redder, a sign of just having finished praying. Others would deliberately sleep less before a major ceremony, so their eyes would be slightly swollen in the morning, adding to the authenticity. Society at that time did not reward healthy eyes. It rewarded eyes that could tell a sad story. In the Middle Ages, the eyes were not just a feature of beauty. They were a mirror reflecting morality. A direct, fiery gaze was considered arrogant. A sharp, curious gaze was seen as ill-mannered. Only a gently lowered gaze, both distant and weary, was pure enough to put others at ease. The eyes were not allowed to be noisy, not allowed to dance, but had to be silent like two lakes at twilight. This created a strange paradox. The less expression, the purer one was considered. Women were taught to guard their eyes as one would guard a church door, not letting the fires of ordinary life get in. A tired gaze, detached from reality, was therefore elevated to the standard. And so, while the body cried out for rest, the eyes were turned into a social tool to prove virtue. Looking at the paintings of that era, you will see that the eyes were often drawn more sunken than in real life, the eyelashes as heavy as if on the verge of sleep. The artists were not just painting models, they were painting an ideal. That ideal said, a beautiful person is a tired person. And when a series of such paintings hung on the walls of churches, castles, and great halls, they became giant advertisements for a pathological taste. People in real life looked at the paintings, looked in the mirror, and then tried to turn themselves into copies of copies. That strange loop made an entire society gradually believe that healthy eyes were a defect. But like all other standards, there were always consequences behind it. Lack of sleep, deliberate all-nighters, or putting irritating solutions in the eyes caused many women long-term problems. Dry eyes, eyelid inflammation, and even vision loss. Some gradually went blind without anyone daring to admit the real cause. In society's optimistic view, they simply became those who had dedicated their eyes to God. A sugar-coated praise for a very worldly tragedy. Similarly, peasants in the fields, who had to keep their eyes open under the bright sun and needed strong eyes to live, could never achieve the standard sad gaze. They were considered vulgar, less refined. Beauty, once again, was clearly separated between the class that could rest and the class that had to labor. And then, as you lie down, your eyes also grow heavy. But unlike the young ladies of the past, you don't need to pretend to be sorrowful to be praised. You close your eyes just to sleep, not for anyone else to see. In the darkness, your eyes don't need to be beautiful, don't need to tell any story. They just need to close, to let the darkness flood in naturally. Because if there is one standard you need, it is this. Eyes were made to rest, not to prove loyalty or sadness. And when your eyelids close, you are truly free. A freedom the people of the Middle Ages never dared to dream of. In the Middle Ages, people did not dream of skin as radiant as the sun. They dreamed of skin that had never known what the sun was. The whiter, the paler, the more wax-like the skin, the more it proved you were different. It was not simply the color of the body, but a social passport for you to enter the world of the powerful. You can imagine, in the middle of a market, peasant women with dark, sunburnt skin are laughing loudly after a day of field work. And then, from a distance, a carriage rolls by, revealing a face so white it stands out like a candle in the night. Everyone falls silent. That silence is not because of natural beauty, but because that skin is speaking for its status. I do not labor. I belong to another world. Beauty here was so strange that it mixed fragility with danger. A pale, anemic body, a sign of illness for an ordinary person, was elevated to an aesthetic standard. The reason was very simple. Illness was associated with not working. Whoever had the time to be weak was the one with privilege. Fragility became an ornament. A young lady who hardly left her private room, only sitting to read the Bible by candlelight, was considered noble. Meanwhile, a healthy, robust girl with skin glistening with sweat was seen as vulgar. A cruel paradox. Society praised the weak, the cold, the lifeless, because only the rich had the right to be weak, to keep their skin from touching the sun. Noble women had a whole art of defense. They went out with enormous hoods, the fabric brims covering their faces so much that only their eyes were visible. They used umbrellas made of thick cloth, not to keep the rain off, but to keep the sun from touching them. They walked in their gardens only at dusk, when the light was soft, as if the sun itself had to avoid them. Some wealthy mistresses even hired servants to walk ahead, holding a large piece of cloth like a mobile curtain, so that their every step would never be molested by the sun. It is said that some noble families even had stone-vaulted corridors built around their gardens, so that the young ladies could stroll without a single ray of sun reaching them. All of nature was turned into a prison to shield a kind of living dead beauty. In literature and poetry, this paleness was compared to images that were not at all warm. White as candle wax, white as a shroud, or white as the moon shining on a grave. These similes were not romantic, but they made the listener shudder, and then admire. A lady with pale skin did not need to say much. Just by entering a room, everyone would think to themselves, "She is so fragilely beautiful," as if she could break at any moment. And it was precisely that half-alive, half-dead feeling that fascinated society. There is a record of a peasant girl who married a wealthy master. After a year, she returned to her village with a face so white that her friends did not recognize her. People whispered, "Her life has changed." But along with that, others also whispered, "She looks like she just stepped out of a crypt." In another mansion, a lady once proudly told her guests, "In my life, I have never had to look directly at the sun." That statement, instead of causing astonishment, was praised as proof of her refinement. In religious paintings, the Virgin Mary and the saints were often depicted with unusually white skin. These paintings hung in every church, castle, and monastery. Invisibly, they turned white skin into the seal of holiness. People looked at the paintings, looked in the mirror, and then tried to turn themselves into a version of the sacred figures. When art and religion simultaneously praised it, this standard left no room for resistance. Anyone different would be seen as inferior, or even sinful. And now, try to imagine yourself as a medieval young lady, preparing for bed. You lie in a stone room, a candle flickering, your skin still not shedding its pale color. No one praises you for being healthy. No one tells you that you are radiant. They only praise, "You look like an angel who has left her mortal coil." You close your eyes. In the darkness, the paleness of your skin is no longer visible to anyone. There is only you and your steady breath. In that moment, you understand. White skin was not for showing off, but for hiding. Hiding from the sun, from the earth, from life, and even from yourself. If skin, as white as a corpse, was the ticket into the world of the aristocracy, then hair was the crown that medieval society placed on a woman's head. But this crown was both brilliant and dangerous. It could elevate you to the image of a saint, or it could turn you into kindling for judgment. Long, smooth, lustrous hair was seen as a sign of perfect femininity. Surviving records describe young women with blonde hair, like sunlight through a glass of honey wine, or black hair, like the night embracing the soul. Hair was not just a part of the body. It was a whole world for men to praise and for women to preserve. However, the more beautiful it was, the more dangerous it became, because in religious belief, hair was also a source of temptation. Long, flowing hair could be seen as a signal of licentiousness, an invitation that society would judge. Thus, hair was like a double-edged sword. To show it was to be condemned. To hide it was to be forgotten. To avoid scrutiny, aristocratic women often hid their hair in headscarves, golden nets, or strange tall hats. Especially in church, revealing one's hair was considered sacrilegious. It was believed that hair that was too beautiful could distract men during prayer. Some places even enacted laws. Married women were required to cover their hair when they went out, as a way of marking that this beauty is already owned. Yet, within this concealment lay a paradox. The more hair was covered, the more curious people became. It was like a hidden treasure. The more tightly it was locked away, the more it ignited the imagination. At lavish banquets, hair could be transformed into a sculpture. Some ladies braided their hair into a circle around their heads, adding ribbons and pearls. Others styled their hair into a high bun, covering it with a thin lace veil to be both modest and subtly showing off. Each hairstyle was not just about aesthetics, but a social statement. The more complex the hairstyle, the more it proved that you had hours to sit for a servant to groom you. And of course, only the rich had that luxury. Meanwhile, messy, short-cut, or visibly greasy hair was immediately associated with the image of the lower class, or worse, a witch. In many sermons, priests described hair as the devil's net. They warned that men could fall from grace just because of a lock of hair falling on a woman's cheek. This made many women live in fear. A gust of wind accidentally blowing off a headscarf, revealing their hair, was enough to earn them a bad reputation for life. Beauty, instead of being a gift, became a trap. The more beautiful you were, the more you had to be on guard. There is a story of a young woman in a convent, famous for her hair that reached her waist. Once, she accidentally revealed a few locks and was accused of distracting the young monks. Afterward, she had to cut her hair and live the rest of her life in silence. In contrast, in another palace, a queen once showed off her golden hair, long as a waterfall, and the entire court whispered, calling it the nation's halo. Two opposite fates just because of strands of hair. Imagine, you are a young lady, and at the end of the day, you remove your headscarf, take off your golden clips. Your hair falls to your shoulders, as light as a stream after hours of being bound. You lie down in bed, letting your hair spread on the pillow. In that moment, no one is watching, no one is judging, no one is jealous. There's only you, the darkness, and your hair, as soft as an extra blanket. Hair, which was a trap by day, now becomes a comfort in the night. It whispers to you that sometimes beauty is only truly free when no one is looking. If hair was the halo hanging over the head, then the teeth were like an iron gate locked shut in the mouth. In the Middle Ages, few dared to open that gate too wide. A smile, instead of being a sign of joy, could become a sentence. Today, we consider a smile a communication tool. The more radiant, the friendlier. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, a wide smile was considered improper. A woman who laughed showing her teeth was seen as loose, even vulgar. A respectable lady had to keep her lips closed, only slightly turning up the corners of her mouth, as if her whole face wore an invisible lock. You can imagine, at a banquet, a servant tells a joke. The whole room bursts into laughter, but in a corner, a noble young lady just places her hand over her mouth, giving a discreet, slight smile. She was not allowed to let out a laugh, because just one excessive parting of the lips was enough for people to label her. She lacks breeding. In reality, most teeth in those days were not something anyone wanted to show off. With a diet high in sugar from honey, sweet ale, coarse bread, and almost no concept of modern dentistry, teeth quickly decayed, discolored, and loosened. A complete, even, and bright smile was so rare it was praised as a miracle. There is a record of a nobleman with a full set of teeth entering a feast, and the guests whispered as if they had just witnessed a treasure. Meanwhile, the majority smiled with their lips pursed, hiding their chipped teeth, as if the whole of society was living with a shameful secret. The upper class, eager to be different, was even more afraid of revealing their bad teeth. So, instead of smiling, they chose to wear icy expressions. Lips tightly closed, eyes gazing into the distance, a kind of beauty with the quality of a stone statue. People praised that solemnity, but in reality, it was built on a foundation of fear. The fear that someone would see the decay within. And so, the teeth, born to chew and to smile, were turned into a secret, a forbidden land. In the church, the figures of saints were almost never depicted with a smile showing teeth. The Virgin Mary, angels, female saints, All maintained a closed, gentle smile, but absolutely did not reveal their teeth. Art helped to reinforce the notion. Teeth were something to be hidden, and a radiant smile was seen as a sign of weakness, even sin. Anyone who laughed loudly in church was likely to be labeled as impious. And so, even joy had to be suppressed. In the countryside, people had no way to care for their teeth, so they often decayed very early. A 16-year-old girl might have already lost several front teeth, but society still forced them to be silent, not to complain, because it was a common fate. Meanwhile, a few wealthy people sought treatment, using false teeth made from animal bone, wood, or even the teeth of the dead. But these dentures were often loose, painful, and only served to remind them that a smile was a trap. Instead of being free, the smile became a shackle passed down from one generation to the next. It is said that there was a famously beautiful lady, but her teeth had decayed early. Whenever she attended a banquet, she would eat with a small silver spoon, keeping her lips closed, never chewing loudly. And everyone would marvel. She is so elegant. No one dared to say that. In fact, she was hiding a set of broken teeth. In another village, a girl with a rare, radiant smile, even and bright, was considered strange. People whispered that perhaps she had been gifted by the devil, because in a world full of rotten teeth, a beautiful smile suddenly became suspicious. You can imagine yourself as a medieval young lady, standing before a bronze mirror, looking at your dim reflection. You purse your lips, adjust your headscarf, and remind yourself, don't laugh loudly. Don't let anyone see. Even in your private moments, your smile is shackled by the voice of society. Then at night, you lie down, your head on a straw pillow. No one is watching. No one is judging. You try to smile, letting your teeth touch the darkness. But the obsession follows you into your sleep. The smile, which should be a sign of happiness, is now just a burden, a forbidden thing. And so, the medieval night continues to lull people to sleep with the silence of smiles that were never set free. If hair was once a halo and teeth an invisible shackle, then the body was the frame upon which the whole of medieval society hung its distorted notions. Beauty was not associated with strength, but with fragility, with weakness, as if a person was only truly noble when they looked more like an easily broken flower than a sturdy tree. Today, we often praise a toned, muscular body. But in the cold stone halls of medieval Europe, that was the image of the working class. A woman with strong arms and broad shoulders was immediately labeled a field worker. The ideal beauty, according to the songs and paintings, was a small, narrow-shouldered figure with a gentle gait, as if any gust of wind could blow her over. It was believed that a weak body proved you did not have to labor, did not have to touch dirty soil, or carry daily burdens. This made the body no longer simply biological, but a class statement. The thinner and weaker a woman was, the more it proved she belonged to a class rich enough to hire servants to do everything. A young lady who was plump from being well-fed could be considered healthy, but only if she maintained a softness and did not reveal any muscle. The body, therefore, was not just to be looked at, but to be read. Everyone had to learn to look at the gait, the shoulders, the waist, to judge status. More than once, beauty was described with words reminiscent of illness. Pale skin, trembling hands, a slender figure, all were called ethereal. There are even records of noble ladies deliberately eating less or drinking diuretic herbs to maintain a weak, slender figure. A paradox. Health, the very sign of life, was considered ungraceful, while frailty, the sign of illness, was labeled noble. Try to imagine a noble young lady sitting in a cold room, wearing a heavy dress. Underneath that fabric, she was not allowed to run, not allowed to climb, not allowed to exercise her body. The dress, wide and long, was both a decoration and a cage. It hindered her every step, forcing her body to be weak. Some places even encouraged women to practice walking slowly, deliberately taking small steps, so that the body would not become too strong. Weakness was not just expected, it was practiced. Medieval painting and sculpture did not often idealize muscles as in ancient Greece. Instead, female figures were usually small, delicate, with waists hidden under thick layers of fabric. Even the figures of saints were depicted as ethereal shadows, with no physical strength, only spiritual power. Art did not just reflect society, it trained the human eye to see weakness as beautiful. There is an anecdote about a gentleman who fell in love with a fisherman's daughter because she was strong, a good swimmer, and could carry heavy nets. But when he boasted to his friends, they mocked him. "You love a woman with the shoulders of a sailor." And so, his love was considered eccentric, against the norm. In another region, a girl who was too thin and often sick was praised as a delicate lily. Men competed to write poems in her honor, while in reality, she was slowly dying of tuberculosis. When society glorifies weakness, those who are truly healthy, working in the fields, are looked down upon. A bitter paradox. It was they, the laborers, the ones who fed the whole of society, who were considered coarse and ugly. Meanwhile, the weak bodies, living in silk and velvet, became the standard. And so, the body became a shackle. It forced people to live against nature, turning beauty into a performance where fragility was admired and strength was denied. Try to imagine yourself as a medieval young lady, after a whole day of sitting still in a thick dress, finally returning to your room. You unlace your bodice, let your body relax, and sigh. Your body wants to run, to jump, to laugh loudly, but even in your dreams, you see yourself having to maintain a slender, weak figure, because that is the only ticket for you to be called beautiful. And so, the body, which is a gift of life, became a prison, a burden you had to carry for your entire life. If hair was a halo, skin a mirror, and the body a cage, then the hands were the most honest place where the people of the Middle Ages were revealed. No cloth could completely hide the hands. When you signed a contract, raised a glass of wine, or simply opened a door, people would look at your hands and immediately read your status like an open book. In medieval society, the hands did not know how to lie. The peasant had calloused hands, nails blackened with dirt, joints swollen from the cold. The blacksmith had seared hands, stained with iron, calloused as thick as animal hide. In contrast, the nobility had to keep their hands white, soft, and as delicate as flower petals. There was a whole unwritten language of the hands. When a young lady extended her hand, if it was slender and white, it was enough to make a deeper impression than any jewelry. Because that hand proved that she had never had to touch a hoe or spade, never touch the dirty water of the village well. To reinforce this difference, the upper class turned their hands into a place of display. Gold rings, silver rings, precious gems, and even small relics were worn on their fingers as both talismans and declarations of status. And above all, gloves, the symbol of refinement. A gentleman could throw down his glove to challenge someone to a duel. A lady could gently offer her glove to a knight as a promise. Gloves became an intermediary, hiding the truth, but also displaying power. The paradox is, people wore gloves to hide their hands, but the very act of being able to wear gloves proved you were rich enough not to need to use your hands for labor. In paintings and sculptures, the hands of God, the Virgin Mary, or the saints were often raised in blessing. An open palm symbolized forgiveness and protection. But those same hands could also become instruments of punishment. When clergymen raised their hands in condemnation, when a forefinger pointed directly at a sinner, the hand thus carried two opposite poles, blessing and curse. It was believed that the touch of a saint could heal the sick, while the hand of a witch spread disaster. There were trials where the hand became evidence. A woman could be accused of being a witch just because her fingernails were unusually long, or because she had a mole on her palm. The hands, which were just a part of the body, suddenly became evidence for an imaginary crime. In some places, punishments were aimed directly at the hands, cutting off fingers, branding with a hot iron, or shackling the hands to a post. This was not just physical punishment, but symbolic punishment, taking away the tools of labor, communication, and prayer. In romantic ballads, the hand was where affection began. A knight only needed to touch the sleeve, or gently take the gloved hand of a lady to consider it a promise received. It is said that some young men kept their beloved's glove over their heart for their entire lives, considering it a talisman in battle. Medieval love did not need public kisses. A single touch of the hand was enough to make the heart flutter. But if the hand was a symbol of power and love, it was also a symbol of imprisonment. Think of the chapped hands of servants in winter, still having to carry buckets of water and baskets of coal, while the gloved hands of the nobility only held a glass of wine. Or the shackled hands of prisoners, trembling in the firelight of the church. Those hands, which once held a hoe or a spoon, were now just a symbol of helplessness. Medieval society turned the hands into a sentence. Beautiful hands were admired, ugly hands were despised, and hands accused of witchcraft brought death. Some even believed that the lines on the palm revealed one's fate, as if you were destined from birth by the very shape of your own palm. And so, the hands, the most honest tool of labor, were forced to carry countless layers of symbols, to the point that people themselves could no longer see their own real hands. Try to imagine yourself as a young lady, sitting by the window in a stone room. You turn your hand under the moonlight, seeing the slender but chapped fingers from the cold. You ask yourself, will people see who I am just through these hands? And in the cold wind, you realize your hands are not just yours. They are where the whole of society carves its mark. They carry tools, love, power, and also a curse. You cannot escape it, not even in your dreams. If the hands were the tools for work and giving, then the feet were the tools of freedom. Because as long as one had feet, one could go far, could run away, could step beyond the boundaries that society had erected. But in the context of the Middle Ages, where everything was bound by class, religion, and harsh standards, the feet were rarely allowed to be free. You didn't need to see a face. Just by looking at the shoes, people knew who you were. Peasants went barefoot or wore rough wooden clogs, their feet chapped, calloused, and covered in mud. Craftsmen wore simple leather shoes, convenient for standing for hours by the forge or workbench. The nobility, on the other hand, wore long pointed shoes. The pointier, the more it proved their status, even though they couldn't run or do anything useful. The feet became a display of status. Swollen feet from the cold winter proved you belonged to the lowest class, while feet hidden in silk shoes proved you had never had to wade through mud. For noble women, walking was not simply moving. It had to be slow, gentle, even constrained to prove modesty. There were even lessons teaching young ladies how to walk, not to take wide strides, not to exert force, but to move as if their feet were gliding across the stone floor. A young lady was praised for having an angelic gait when her steps were small and trembling, as if she could fall at any moment. This means that the most beautiful way of walking was the weakest. Clothing was the shackle of the feet. Long dresses that swept the floor, heavy and layered, made walking a challenge. A lady could not run and could hardly even climb stairs quickly. It was a subtle form of control. Clothing turned the feet into ornaments, no longer tools of freedom. Meanwhile, peasants and servants had to run and walk quickly, their feet trained by labor. But this very thing made them looked down upon. A strong gait, lower class. In medieval religion, the feet had a strange position. People washed feet to show humility, a ritual that monks held in high regard. Christ was described as having washed the feet of his disciples to teach a lesson about service. Yet those same feet were also associated with sin. A woman showing her ankles could be considered seductive. Bare feet in church were seen as disrespectful, a part of the body that was both sacred and controlled by countless rules. In many places, punishments aimed at the feet were very common. People used red-hot tongs to press against the feet, nailed criminals through the ankles, or forced them to walk on hot coals, believing that the feet will tell the truth. The innocent would walk through fire without being burned. In war, enemies had their Achilles tendons cut so they could not go far. The feet, the tools of freedom, were turned into an easily controlled weak point. Imagine a medieval young lady walking through a wide hall. Each of her steps is weighed down by a heavy dress, limited by the scrutinizing eyes of everyone. She cannot run, cannot jump, cannot spread her legs wide. Even when the music starts, her dance must be gentle and slow, not revealing any strength. In contrast, out in the fields, chapped feet, purple from the frost, had to run, jump, and carry burdens all day. And when evening came, they were not praised as beautiful, but only seen as worn-out tools. In large cities, the way one walked was also a way of social control. People could recognize a stranger just by their gait. A country person walking in the city with long, hurried steps would be immediately revealed, while a city gentleman walked slowly, showing his abundance of time. Even the sound of footsteps on the stone floor was listened to. The heavy, echoing sound of shoes announced a servant. The soft swish of silk shoes announced a nobleman. The feet became the unwilling signature of each person. Imagine yourself as a noble young lady, walking through a cold corridor. your feet tightly bound in long, pointed shoes under a heavy dress. The sound of your footsteps echoes, slow, like tapping on stone. You wish you could run, jump, but you can only dream. Or you are a peasant, walking barefoot on the cold ground, each crack stinging. You walk not because you want to, but because you have to. Your feet do not bring you freedom, but only remind you of the shackles of endless labor. And so, the feet, the part of the body born to take people everywhere, were turned by society into a tool of control. Walking became a language, a shackle, a sign of status. People were no longer free to walk as they pleased, but had to walk to the rhythms imposed by class and standards. At night, when everyone was asleep, only the sound of footsteps echoed in dreams. Fragile, shackled footsteps, yet still yearning for a day of freedom. Perhaps nothing is as honest and revealing of one's status as the voice. You can cover your face with a scarf, hide your hands in gloves, hide your feet in shoes. But once you speak, everyone will know immediately who you are, where you come from, and what class you belong to. In the Middle Ages, the voice was not just sound. It was a measure of dignity, of education, and also an invisible trap that society set to bind every individual. In large cities like Paris or London, you only needed to utter a few words to be immediately classified. The peasant's voice was heavy, rough, thick, with a local accent. The merchant's voice was sharp, quick, mixed with many borrowed words. The nobleman's voice was trained with a drawn-out rhythm, unhurried, as if each word carried power. Language was an invisible wall. No guards, no chains. Just a voice was enough to prevent you from entering a higher class. In the Great Hall, men's voices were trained to carry far, to command. Knights and gentlemen were taught to speak slowly, firmly, with emphasis. A word could start a battle. A shout could make soldiers charge. But that voice could also easily become a shackle. A man of a lower class who dared to speak loudly before a nobleman would be considered insolent, even punished. The louder the voice, the heavier the punishment. For women, the voice was bound by even harsher standards. It was taught that a modest lady must speak softly, not interrupt, not laugh too loudly. A woman's voice that echoed in the hall could be considered impertinent. Many medieval proverbs associated a woman's voice with trouble. A woman's talk is like the wind that bends the tower. This very prejudice turned the female voice into a trap. Even if she was educated, had ideas, if she spoke at the wrong time, she would immediately become an object of ridicule. In heresy trials, the accused were forced to defend themselves, but the paradox was this. The very trembling, off-key voice from fear was considered proof of guilt. It was believed that a witch's voice sounded hoarse, that a liar's voice could not keep a rhythm. Just a small tremor in the tone could decide a life. Only in music did the voice escape its shackles. Whether it was a hymn in the church or a folk song in the market, music allowed suppressed voices to explode. A country girl could sing loudly by the well. A servant could hum in the kitchen. And for a moment, their voices were no longer measured by class. Music was a small crack for people to find a little freedom in the giant cage of society. Conversely, sometimes the voice did not need to be loud. A whisper was enough to carry power. In the court, a whisper could bring down a nobleman. In the church, a whispered confession became a sentence for the soul itself. Silence was also a kind of voice, a woman choosing not to answer, a peasant bowing his head in silence, all were sounds that society read in its own way. Imagine a young lady sitting in a stone room. All day, she is taught to speak softly, to laugh gently, to keep her voice like a whisper of wind. But at night, when everyone is asleep, she dares to sing softly. Her voice echoes in the cold room, trembling, but free. Or a peasant in the field, humming an old song while he plows. No one hears his voice, no one judges it, but that very sound keeps him from despair. And so, the voice, the sound born for people to express themselves, became a shackle. It revealed class, bound gender, became evidence in court, a tool of power. Only in music, or in the whispers of the night, did the voice truly belong to the one who uttered it. Society could bind hands, shackle feet, and even take away the freedom of the body, but the voice, though suppressed, still echoed in memory, still seeped through stone walls, still left its mark on the hearts of those who heard it. And sometimes, the weakest whisper outlived all the powerful shouts. The people of the Middle Ages had a whispered saying, "The eyes are the mirror of the soul." But in a world where every gesture was monitored, the eyes were not just a mirror reflecting the inside. They were also a locked door, upon which society erected countless rules. Try to imagine. A young lady stands at her wedding ceremony. On her face, no one pays much attention to her skin or hair. All eyes are on her eyes. Will she dare to look directly at the groom, or will she lower her head demurely? A single glance, just a fleeting one, could determine her honor for a lifetime. In the courts, the gaze was a weapon sharper than any sword. A king only needed to glance for his subjects to bow their heads. A lord could make a servant tremble with just a heavy, contemptuous look. Here, power did not need to be spoken. It existed in the gaze, forcing those below to submit. Anyone who dared to defy that gaze, even with a direct look, would be considered sacrilegious. Thus, the eyes of the nobility were trained as a kind of ritual, opening slowly, looking directly, but not for too long, shifting the eyes as if everything around was trivial. The gaze became an art of domination. Conversely, for peasants and women, the eyes were often forced to flee. A peasant who met a lord and dared to look him in the eye would immediately be considered insolent. A maid who looked directly into her master's eyes could easily be accused of seduction. In the Bible and canon law, it was even taught that a virtuous woman must keep a humble gaze. Eyes that knew how to look down were seen as proof of submission. And a sharp gaze? That was the gaze of a witch, and that suspicion alone was enough to lead her to the stake. But the eyes are inherently difficult to hide. A person can lie with words, can pretend to smile, but in their eyes, the truth still flickers. The people of the Middle Ages believed that the devil could hide in a smile, but could not hide in the eyes. Therefore, in trials, the judge would often stare into the eyes of the accused. If the eyes trembled, darted back and forth, it was immediately considered a sign of guilt. Eyes dry from crying or glistening with fear were often interpreted as evidence for what had already been decided. Another aspect cannot be ignored: love. In a society bound by arranged marriages, the eyes were sometimes the only language for love. A knight dared not speak words of love, but could give a long look at a banquet. A young lady could not openly refuse her chosen husband, but the look she sent to another was enough to say everything. In the old love songs, the eyes were mentioned more often than the lips, because the lips were locked in silence, but the eyes could still speak for the heart. However, the eyes could also easily be turned into an accusation. Women with sharp, deep eyes were often associated with witchcraft. They were said to be able to curse others with just a look. Folklore is full of warnings. Don't look into the eyes of a black cat. Don't let a witch look you in the eye. Don't look at a corpse for too long. All of this turned the eyes into a forbidden, haunting zone. To cope, the people of the Middle Ages invented many ways to hide their eyes. Festival masks, where you could see without being seen. The veil of a noblewoman, both a symbol of modesty and a subtle weapon. She could observe the world, but the world could not see through her. Colored glasses, though rare, sometimes used by the nobility to create an air of mystery, making it difficult for others to guess their true gaze. Hiding the eyes also meant hiding the soul, as a way of preserving the last vestige of freedom. And when night fell, the eyes took on a different meaning. In the dark rooms, the gaze no longer held power, no longer had ceremony. It returned to its true nature, fragile and in need of comfort. A peasant child hugs a pillow, looking at his mother in the flickering firelight. An old knight looks up at the sky, searching for a familiar star to recall childhood memories. A maid looks into the water in a basin, wondering if her eyes are really as evil as people say. In those moments, the eyes were no longer locked. They were simply eyes, the only window for people to look out and to look into themselves. And so, in a world where every part of the body was molded by society, the eyes still held a special paradox. They were both the mirror of the soul and a shackle. They could give love, and they could bring punishment. They could make a person honored or condemned. The eyes do not lie, the people of the Middle Ages believed. But it was this very belief that turned the eyes into a cage, where the truth was distorted to serve power. And perhaps only when you close your eyes and fall asleep are the eyes truly free. In the medieval world, everything was monitored. From the gaze, the voice, the gait, the skin, the hair, all belonged to an invisible code that society laid down. People lived, breathed, and existed under hundreds of judgmental eyes. But then every night, when the candles burned down and the window frames were filled with thick blackness, there was a realm that no lord, no priest, no law could completely control. Sleep. Imagine a noble's chamber, a four-poster bed, deep red velvet curtains, a thick straw mattress topped with goose feathers. The candle casts a dim light on the curtain, turning the bed into a cocoon. There, the lord and lady shed the ceremonies of the day, leaving only the sound of steady breathing. Then step outside to a peasant's wooden hut. The whole family lies crowded on a pile of straw. The chicken, the dog, even the pig are there, snoring right beside them. No velvet curtains, only darkness and body heat. And in that makeshift place, they too found a piece of freedom that the day never offered. The bed, whether luxurious or poor, was the border between the noisy world of society and the private world of the inner self. By day, the hands had to labor, the feet had to follow a set path, the eyes had to avoid the gaze of the powerful. But in sleep, the body escaped all discipline. You could dream of flying, dream of crying, dream of loving someone you were not allowed to love. The people of the Middle Ages believed that dreams were messages from God or whispers from the devil. But they also knew that dreaming was the only moment when the mind was no longer shackled. For this reason, sleep became a silent rebellion, where everyone, from king to peasant, returned to being an ordinary human being. Sleeping posture also divided the classes. The nobility slept on their backs, hands neatly placed, as if even in dreams they had to maintain their dignity. Meanwhile, peasants slept curled up, turning constantly to find warmth. There are records that knights sometimes slept with their armor beside the bed in case of an enemy attack. Conversely, beggars slept right on the street, their backs against a cold stone wall. Sleep, though the freest of states, still reflected deep injustice. In the darkness, no one could observe you anymore. Light was an ally of power, where the strong scrutinized the weak. But when night fell, darkness sheltered all. A serf girl did not have to bow her head. A widow was no longer stared at. A child no longer heard his father scolding. The night was a common blanket, and sleep was an invisible house that contained everyone. The people of the Middle Ages wrote much about dreams. Some dreamed of angels, some of demons. Some dreamed of flying, of eating their fill, while by day they only had a crumb of bread. The interesting thing is, although they believed dreams were divine messages, deep down everyone understood. A dream was a place where they could live differently, a place where a maid could become a queen, a place where a peasant could stand on a horse's back, a shining sword in his hand, a place where a widow could hold her lost husband again. A dream was the rough draft of a life that could not be real. Notice, in sleep, all that remains is the sound of steady breathing. By day, breath is ragged from labor, hurried from fear, or choked by forced silence. But in sleep, breath returns to its natural rhythm. That breath is the freest lullaby, simple and something no one can take away. A poor child sleeping on a pile of straw and a prince in a castle. Both are left with only the sound of soft breathing merging into the night. However, there were also those who were deprived of the right to sleep. The city guard, the jailer, even mothers with newborns. For them, sleep was a luxury. Every time they dozed off, it was a gamble, a loss of vigilance, a loss of life, or the loss of their infant child. The people of the Middle Ages had a cruel curse. May you never sleep peacefully. Because whoever cannot sleep is no longer a complete human being. In medieval culture, sleep was often likened to the brother of death. It is no coincidence that tomb effigies often depict the deceased in a sleeping posture. Sleep was a rehearsal for death, but also proof that you were still alive. In that oppressive society, this paradox became a comfort. At least in sleep, you were as free as a soul that had left its body. Sleep was a secret land. It did not distinguish between high and low, needed no laws, feared no watchful eyes. In sleep, you could live another life, even if only in a dream. And perhaps that is why, every night, as the candles went out, millions of medieval people willingly surrendered themselves to the darkness. They knew that, for just a few short hours, they were masters of their own bodies and souls. Sleep was the only freedom left. Perhaps nothing is simpler than breath. It begins when a child lets out its first cry, and ends when the chest stops rising and falling. Between those 2 points is a whole lifetime. But in the Middle Ages, breath was not just proof of life. It was also a sign of sin, of submission, and of the death that lurked at every moment. By day, The fields glistened with dew, and droves of peasants bent their backs to plow. Their breath was ragged, hoarse, filled with dust and the smell of sweat. Each breath was a swing of the hoe, each gasp a foot of earth turned over. The people of the Middle Ages were used to living with exhaustion. Breathing was not a right, but a burden. To inhale was to take in the dust of the stables. To exhale was to release into the air a smell of poverty that never dissipated. In the great halls of the lords, breath took a different form. The powerful breathed slowly, as if the very air had to fall silent to listen to them. A king's sneeze could become a rumor. A sigh could decide the fates of a dynasty. Even at banquets, servants had to pay attention to their master's breathing. If his breath was rapid, it was a sign he had drunk too much wine. Water must be brought quickly. If he sighed, they knew to kneel and flatter. Breath, seemingly personal, also became a tool to maintain power. For women, breath was a danger. Tight bodices constricted their chests, forcing them to take short, rapid breaths, as if each inhalation was a link in an invisible chain. A woman who breathed heavily in public would be considered loose, indecent. A girl who dared to sigh during a church service could be accused of disrespect. Even a soft breath during a laugh could get them labeled as flirtatious. In that society, even breath was molded to fit the rules. Nowhere did breath become more terrifying than when disease spread. In the villages stained with the grief of the Black Death, breath was turned into a curse. People were afraid to stand near each other, because just one breath mixed with the smell of blood and pus was enough to spread death. The sick wheezed, their lungs whistling like a lament. Breath was no longer the rhythm of life, but the knock of death at the door. Anyone who heard it knew the end was not far. Yet, in the rare dark corners of life, breath was also proof of affection. A pair of lovers who could not speak their words could only sit side by side, listening to each other's breath. The synchronized rhythm was like a silent pact, stronger than any contract written on paper. On a cold winter's night, a peasant held his wife, sharing the same breath, warming each other with the simple rhythm of life. In that moment, breath was the flame that kept people going. In the church, breath was seen as the soul temporarily residing in the body. Monks prayed with rhythmic breaths, as if wanting to synchronize themselves with the rhythm of God. It was believed that if one prayed long enough, the breath would become lighter, almost disappearing. That was when the soul reached a state of purification. But there were also those who were forced to hold their breath. The punishment of being submerged in water or forced into a dark cell were all based on cutting off the breath. That society believed that soul and breath were linked, and to take away the breath was to take away the presence of a person. Death, in medieval culture, was always defined by the last breath. The family would gather around the deathbed, waiting. When the chest stopped moving, when the breath disappeared, that was the moment life left the body. Many people recounted seeing a thin wisp of smoke leave the mouth of the deceased, proof that the soul had just departed. Sometimes it was a faint fragrance, sometimes a coldness that spread throughout the room. That last breath became the final whisper of a human life. And so, in a society full of shackles, breath was a simple but sacred thing. It connected life with death, happiness with suffering. You breathe in, you exist. You breathe out, you give a part of yourself. back to the world. The people of the Middle Ages, though afraid of many things, still understood that as long as they were breathing, they could still hope. And when they no longer breathed, they also believed they had stepped into another, freer realm, where there were no lords, no laws, no judgment. Breath, seemingly small, was the very drumbeat of the entire medieval life. It sounded in the fields, in the churches, in the bedrooms, and even on the executioner's block. It was both the rhythm of life and the rhythm of death. And when you gently close your eyes and exhale slowly, you are also repeating that eternal act. The act of people who once lived, loved, suffered, and hoped in a dark world that never completely took away the right to dream. Their last breath still echoes in you, like a lullaby that stretches across the centuries. In the narrow streets of the Middle Ages, where the paving stones were damp with mold and the tiled roofs huddled together as if to swallow the sky, scent was always present. It needed no words, no form. It lurked, persistent, clinging to human flesh like an invisible curse. If the eyes could be closed, the ears could be covered, then the nose, and the memories it evoked, could never escape its haunting power. Scent, in that place, was not merely a sensation. It was a sign of class, of the body's condition, of the soul itself. It breathed into the air a silent confession, which no one in that society could deny. Try to imagine stepping down into the market fair where the common people gathered. The first smell that hits you is not that of fresh fruit, but a mixture of mud, animal dung, and waste. Meat hangs in the sun, beginning to give off a rancid smell before it can be sold. Fish brought from the river, still mixed with algae and unwashed, exudes a strong, fishy odor. Each stall is its own landscape of scents. Here the cloying sweetness of thick honey, there the pungent spice of damp pepper. Interspersed with this is the smell of unwashed clothes, the smell of sweat mixed with dirt, with smoke, with the breath of the crowd. The poor could not hide their status. Just by getting close, their scent revealed everything. In complete contrast, in the palaces or castles of the lords, scent became a decorative weapon of power. Dried herbs, amber, and fragrant woods were burned in the fireplaces to overwhelm the smell of people. On the banquet tables, bowls of soup, rich with cinnamon, cloves, and star anise, steamed up like a declaration of wealth. Noblewomen perfumed themselves with fragrances made from roses, lavender, or expensive musk. A single drop of perfume could be worth a peasant's entire month's wages. But even when covered in precious scents, their bodies were still imprisoned in heavy layers of fabric, causing the smell of their skin to become stuffy and stifling. The scent in the castle was not to make people feel pleasant, but to separate them. It was a declaration. We are different from you, and you can never reach this world. In the church, scent had a different meaning. The smoke of incense rose, mingling with the sound of prayer. Each grain of incense that burned to ash was a soul being cleansed. It was believed that this scent could please God, could carry prayers high. However, even the holy scent could not hide the fact that behind the church walls, people were still people, with the smell of their bodies, the musty smell of damp robes, and the heavy breath after long hours of kneeling. Nothing is more deeply etched in the medieval memory than the smell of death. When plague spread, the entire village was haunted by a smell that no one wanted to name. It was the smell of dried blood on rags, the smell of pus from wounds, the smell of rotting flesh under a shroud. People tried to cover it by stuffing flowers and fragrant leaves into their clothes, their pockets, the masks of the plague doctors. But the smell of death still seeped through every crack in the fabric, haunting even their dreams. Anyone who survived a plague would, for the rest of their life, be sent into a shudder by just a whiff of a similar smell. As the memories came flooding back, in the dimly lit rooms, where lovers hid from the eyes of society, scent played a different role. It could be the smell of mingled skin, of hair infused with kitchen smoke, of dry hay spread on the floor. There was no luxurious perfume, but the closeness turned everyday smells into unforgettable memories. Some women even knew how to use scent as a weapon. A sprig of herbs tucked into their bodice, a little cinnamon oil in their hair, enough to turn their presence into a lingering intoxication. But the price they paid was not small. Just a whisper of the smell of a witch, and their whole life could go up in flames. In the dark kitchen, the smell of burnt bread could recall the meager meal of yesterday. The smell of freshly cut straw recalled harvests past. The musty smell in a prison cell recalled forgotten souls. The people of the Middle Ages did not have paper diaries, but scent was their invisible diary. It followed every breath, recording life and death, joy and fear. The greatest irony is this: the people of that time could not escape scent. It became a social mark that could not be washed away. A peasant could wear a nobleman's old clothes, but the smell of earth and kitchen smoke would still betray his status. A noblewoman could pretend to be a commoner, but the smell of expensive musk would give her away immediately. Scent, from a distance, seems invisible, but the more one lived, the more one realized it was the invisible thread that bound each person to the place society had assigned them. In the medieval world, scent was both a friend and an enemy. It could soothe, and it could condemn. It could lead people to find each other, and it could make them shun an entire community. Today, we can wash, do laundry, and use perfume to choose the scent we want to carry. But if you close your eyes and take a deep breath, perhaps somewhere there still lingers a trace of that ancient time. A musty, pungent, but authentic smell. A scent that once haunted an entire era. Perhaps never in history has clothing been both so redemptive and so confining as in the Middle Ages. It was not simply to cover the body from the cold or to hide the fragility of the flesh. It was a declaration of class, a shield of honor, but at the same time, an invisible shackle that tightened on every movement, every breath. A garment could make you respected, but it could also push you into misery if you did not belong to the class entitled to wear it. And in every fold, every stitch, we see clearly how medieval society tailored the fate of each person. In places where winter was long and the cold dew seeped through every stone crack, clothing was first and foremost a layer of protection. Peasants wore tunics made of coarse, thick, stiff cloth, often not properly washed. It kept them warm, but was also heavy and cumbersome. Craftsmen wore leather aprons to protect against knives, hammers, and fire. Soldiers wore armor and quilted jackets stuffed with straw to ward off arrows and sword blows. These layers of fabric, leather, and metal turned clothing into a second skin, protecting life. But the thicker and heavier it was, the more it reminded people that they too were trapped in a shell that did not belong to their own bodies. In the castle, clothing became a language without words. Color was power. Purple and deep blue were for royalty, deep red for the nobility, while commoners were only allowed to wear earthy tones of brown and gray. The laws of the time were even stricter. Peasants were not allowed to wear silk. Craftsmen were not allowed to wear gold jewelry. And common women were not allowed to wear hats in the style of the nobility. If a poor woman dared to wear a silk dress, the whole village would look at her as a rebel. Clothing, then, was not just a utility. It was a sentence. The heaviest burden was still on women. To be called modest, they had to wear many layers of long dresses, tight bodices, and lace-up waists. The first corsets appeared, squeezing so tightly that breath was cut short and the chest ached. Every step was a challenge. The dress was too long and swept the ground, getting caught in mud, making it impossible for the feet to move quickly. Dancing at festivals, women spun like magnificent flowers, but few saw them gasping for breath under the restrictive fabric. Beauty was defined not by comfort, but by endurance. However, clothing was not just for showing off class or for binding. It was also a mask. A soldier wore armor to hide his trembling. A thief wrapped a scarf around his face to disappear into the darkness. Women wore headscarves to hide from prying eyes. There were monks who wore long robes that touched the ground, hiding their emaciated bodies, so no one would see they were suffering from hunger or illness. And there were also the powerful who used lavish robes to hide the decay in their souls. Clothing was not only heavy on the shoulders, but also heavy in memory. The smell of wool, damp from the rain, the smell of untanned sheepskin, the smell of ash clinging to a soldier's uniform returning from battle, all became indelible marks. A heavily patched garment was proof of a difficult life. A cloak embroidered with gold thread could be passed down through generations as a reminder of family power. There were times when people wished to be naked, just to feel the wind, the sun, the rain on their skin. But medieval society did not allow it. Not dressing properly meant shame and public ridicule. When a criminal was tied up and stripped of his clothes, it was not just physical punishment, but a way of stripping away all dignity. Conversely, when a lord put on a new robe at his coronation, it was the legitimization of his rule. Clothing, in the end, was a shackle that people voluntarily wore, because otherwise they would be seen as outsiders, as unworthy of existing in the general order. In the darkness of a medieval bedroom, you can hear the rustle of fabric as a woman removes her heavy dress. In that moment, her body can finally breathe freely, but only for a moment, because tomorrow she will have to put on the old shell again. Clothing, seemingly a means of protection, ultimately became a prison. It prevented people from ever living fully in their own bodies, always having to perform, to hide, to carry the weight of society's gaze on their shoulders. Today, we wear clothes for personal choice, for aesthetics, or for comfort. But if you look back at the Middle Ages, you will understand that clothing was not just attire. It was a sentence, a shell, and a shackle that bound an entire era. If the beauty of the Middle Ages was a series of shackles binding every part of the body, then food was the invisible thread connecting beauty and survival. Eating was not just a biological need, but a mirror reflecting status, belief, and the harsh standards that society placed on every individual. What you ate, how you ate, it all determined who you were in the eyes of others. And ironically, beauty itself was often built on hunger. In the castles of the nobility, the banquet tables were spread with golden roasted suckling pigs, steaming joints of beef, pure white bread baked from rare fine flour, and red wine flowing from silver goblets. It was not just a meal, it was a declaration. Eating a lot, eating well, eating ostentatiously was how the nobility asserted their power. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, the peasants who bent their backs all day in the fields had only a thin porridge of oats or barley, sometimes mixed with wild greens to trick their stomachs. Meat was a luxury. Many people tasted it only a few times a year, usually on festival days. Their meals were a symbol of deprivation and also proof of their status, imprisoned in poverty. The strange thing is, the beauty of that time was not in a strong physique, the kind that laborers were forced to have. On the contrary, pale skin, a full but weak figure, was considered ideal. And to achieve this look, the nobility ate in their own way. Lots of white flour, lots of sugar, an imported luxury, lots of sweet wine, all of which created a soft and weak body that was considered refined. The peasants, on the other hand, with their meager diet but toned muscles, sinewy shoulders, and tanned skin, were seen as coarse and lowly. Food, therefore, became the scale that determined beauty and ugliness, not just wealth and poverty. It was not only poverty that made people go hungry. In the church, fasting was a ritual. Monks went through long periods of Lent, eating only dry bread and drinking plain water, believing that hunger would purify the soul. Some even saw being emaciated, pale, and weak as a sign of holiness. For noble women, restraining their food intake also became a kind of performance. A young lady who did not eat much at a banquet, it was proof that she did not need muscle strength, that she was so fragile that a little sweet cake was enough. And this very eating little became a standard of beauty, turning hunger into a tool to assert status. In the family, the man was the one who decided who ate what. The head of the household usually sat at the head of the table, served the best piece of meat. The wife and children ate after, and the servants ate last. The meal, which seemed to be about survival, was actually a stage for reenacting the social order. At village festivals, when a rare animal was slaughtered, the best piece was offered to the lord or the priest. The crowd shared the rest, the bones, the organs. It was implicitly understood. Even in eating, power was asserted through injustice. At one extreme, aristocratic beauty was nourished by abundance: white flour, sugar, wine, red meat. At the other extreme, the beauty of the laborers was defined by deprivation. Their bodies reflected labor, not the standard. But both had one thing in common: beauty never came from free choice. It was always the result of an imposed system, where eating was also turned into a shackle. In the memory of many medieval people, taste was linked to status. The smell of freshly baked bread was reminiscent of the church or a lavish banquet, something the poor could only smell but rarely taste. The smell of thin porridge or sauerkraut was the haunting memory of a childhood in the countryside. Some servants recounted that when they brought a platter of meat to the nobility, they trembled with both fear and bitterness, because that delicious smell never belonged to them. And in their dreams, many poor people only dreamed of a loaf of white bread, a simple but distant dream. The irony is that while the lavish banquets were overflowing, many people deliberately fasted to maintain a slender figure. Hunger became part of the standard. A pale woman was considered fragile and charming. A gaunt monk was considered close to God. Hunger was no longer something to be feared. It became a performance of power, a sign to be admired. In the darkness of a medieval kitchen, the red fire cast shadows on the faces. On one side, a rough hand stirred a pot of thin porridge. On the other, fingers adorned with silver rings broke off a piece of tender meat. Between these two worlds was an unbridgeable abyss. Food, which should have been just for sustaining life, became a tool to differentiate, to control, to create a paradoxical standard of beauty. And when night fell, in the sleep of both the full and the hungry, the empty or full stomach was still linked to invisible shackles, something from which no one in that entire era could escape. If the hands, feet, or voice were all visible shackles, then time was the invisible jailer. It had no shape, no voice, but every person in the Middle Ages, from peasant, craftsman to nobleman, clergyman, had to bow to its absolute power. Time was not just measured by sunlight or darkness, but by church bells, by the seasons, by the harsh rhythms imposed on the body and soul. In a medieval village, no one had a personal clock. The substitute for every clock hand was the sound of the church bell. The bell rang at dawn to call everyone to prayer. It rang at noon to signal mealtime, and the evening bell urged all hands to stop work. Even while sleeping, the villagers could be awakened by the bell calling them to a service. For the country folk, the bell was a command. It was like the heartbeat of the community, forcing every individual life to beat in unison. People did not dare to defy the bell, because to defy it was to defy God. Time, thus, was no longer natural. It became a tool to rule the soul. If the church bell ruled each day, then the seasons ruled each year. The sowing season, the harvest season, the harsh winter, all controlled the body. The peasant had no right to choose when to rest. When the harvest came, they had to work from before sunrise until after dark, even if their hands were blistered and their backs were broken. Conversely, winter forced them to huddle in their huts, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the boards, their stomachs growling with hunger. Their whole life was just a cycle. Sow, reap, wait, sow, reap. No one could escape that wheel. Time here was the invisible whip that lashed the back of every status. Have you noticed? Even the standard of beauty was dictated by time. It was said that a young lady was most beautiful at the age of 16, not yet ravaged by labor or childbirth. For women, time was a swift and harsh sentence. Just a few years of youth, and then quickly into the part of life considered old. Among the nobility, women tried every way to hold on to their youthful appearance, using white powder to cover blemishes, wearing tight clothes to maintain their figure. But time spared no one. It seeped into every wrinkle, every gray hair. Beauty, no matter how glamorous, eventually melted away before its erosion. Unlike the country folk and the nobility, the monks lived by the harshest rhythm of time. They divided the day into hours of prayer, matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, then terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. And so, a day was torn into pieces, leaving no room for freedom. Time in the monastery was like a chain wrapped tightly, forcing one to kneel, to read scripture, to sing hymns, and then to do manual labor. The body became a tool to measure time, while the soul was lost in an endless cycle of prayer. In medieval society, everyone had to wait. Waiting for the harvest, waiting for news from the battlefield, waiting for the judgment of the ecclesiastical court, waiting for the plague to pass. Waiting became a permanent state, making people always feel small and helpless. A girl waited for the day she would be married off, like a piece of merchandise. A soldier waited for the order to leave his home. A patient waited for a divine hand to save them. Each wait was a slice of time, gradually wearing people down. All these cycles ultimately led to one point: death. For the people of the Middle Ages, time was not a road opening up to the future, but a rope slowly pulling them towards the grave. Paintings, poems, and even folk songs all reminded them, time erodes beauty. Time gnaws away at life. They often carved images of hourglasses or skeletons holding scythes in books and churches to remind them that time was the invisible grim reaper, that no one could bribe, no one could escape. In the medieval world, you could be imprisoned in a stone jail. You could be shackled with iron, but the strongest bond was still time. It did not scream. It did not have a physical form, but it sliced away each day, drained every breath, and swept every body into its endless cycle. If beauty was the shackle on the outside, then time was the shackle in the blood, flowing with every heartbeat. And perhaps it was the cruelest jailer the people of the Middle Ages ever knew. We have journeyed together through a long narrative, woven from the eyes to the voice, from the hair to the hands, from the breath to time. And now, as the story concludes, we can look at the whole picture. A medieval human body, fragmented by countless standards, shackled by invisible laws, and determined by both the gaze of others and the final jailer, time. What was once called beauty was never just simple admiration. It was a tool, a mask, a double-edged sword, both brilliant and cruel. The people of the Middle Ages did not choose how they were perceived. They were placed on a stage where every scrutinizing gaze was a judgment. The eyes had to be pure, but not too free. The skin had to be pale, even at the cost of illness and deprivation. The body had to be weak to prove nobility. The voice had to be soft, as if the world feared a word of protest. Even essentials like food, sleep, breath, and scent were turned into tools to divide classes and impose power. And then, enveloping everything, was time. The invisible jailer. No one could escape. It tore each day apart with the sound of church bells, with the seasons, with age, with waiting, and finally, with death. The greatest lesson from all these chapters is that beauty is never innocent. Behind every standard, there is always a controlling force, a purpose of control. The human body is the very map upon which these marks of power are deeply carved, where every wrinkle, every gesture, every scent reflects an entire social system. But at the same time, it is from this that we understand the value of freedom. True freedom does not lie in having white skin or silky hair, but in the right to live true to our own bodies, to decide our own breath, voice, and sleep. The people of the Middle Ages did not have that. They lived and died within frameworks they did not choose. And we, today, are still continuing the journey to reclaim that freedom for ourselves. Looking back at the past, we also learned something else. Time is the most just. It favors no class, pays no attention to beauty, cares not for power. It gnaws away at everything, from kings to peasants, from clear eyes to worn-out smiles. The only thing that remains in the end is not the outward appearance, but how people lived, loved, endured together, and shared their suffering. It is memory, humanity, and connection that can overcome the cruel hand of time. So, as we close this journey, let us let beauty cease to be a shackle and return to its true meaning, a reflection of freedom, a vibrancy that comes from each person's choice. And let us also let this story drift away like a lullaby. You can breathe more slowly, let go of the whirlpools of the past, and drift into sleep. Outside, time is still flowing, but right now, in your small space, there is only silence. The eyes close, the breath is steady, and all invisible shackles dissolve. In your dreams, you will no longer see cruel laws, no longer hear the urging bells. There will only be a space of freedom, gentle, where you truly belong. Sleep well.